It is Thanksgiving week here in the States, and I don't know about you guys, but this time of year, from roughly Halloween into New Year's, I always tend to start paying a little bit more attention to the more traditional side of things, as do a lot of Americans. We start to look at family traditions, people start to express their heritage in different ways, but for me, it also means listening to a lot more traditional music. Now, if you follow me outside of YouTube, if you follow me on Instagram or what have you, this will come as no surprise that my true musical heart lies in traditional folk music. And it always has. Traditional folk music was my gateway into learning about music from Europe, despite being from the States myself. So I also don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about traditional music here on the channel. It just hasn't come up. So I'm going to take this opportunity, considering the more traditional time of year, to not only do a little introductory video for those of you looking to get into traditional folk music, but to also answer the many requests that I have gotten from some of you, most notably my patrons over at Patreon, for a little help in tackling the beautiful but intimidating world of traditional folk music from Scandinavia. So, without further ado, let's get into some albums that will help you get into Scandinavian folk, the same way that some of these albums helped me get into traditional Nordic folk. So, let's get into it. So sorry to cut in here so soon into the video. I know we just got started, but I was going back through and editing and realized I left something very important out of the introduction. And that is, if you consider this channel, like one of my main goals here is to offer some different perspectives on some misunderstandings or misrepresentations of Nordic music and Nordic culture. One of the most wildly misunderstood aspects of Nordic culture is the folk music, is the traditional music. Just a little experiment. Go into that YouTube search bar and type in Nordic folk music or even traditional Nordic folk music, and you just get inundated with like TikTok Viking shit. And if you're into that, more power to you. But there's just something like really weird when like you know what traditional Scandinavian music is and you see just more dark folk essentially. That's not what traditional Scandinavian music is, in my opinion. Traditional Nordic music is like way more beautiful and interesting and worthy of respect as it is, rather than like people trying to paint it as something it's not. I guess as an exercise in speaking my mind or putting things bluntly, if you want to say that you're into Nordic culture, then be into Nordic culture as it is. Don't invent a fantasy world that you then call Nordic and then say, oh, I love Nordic culture. It just seems dishonest and it really rubs me the wrong way. I guess, like, long story short, just like be honest about what you're doing. Don't like misrepresent an entire region of the world just because you want it to be something it's not, right? If I'm being a killjoy here, so be it. But I think that it is worth, especially with the purpose of this channel, it is worth starting the conversation talking about Scandinavian folk music as it is, rather than how the internet wants it to be, because we've talked a lot about how people want all Nordic music to be deep, dark, minor, a lot of reverb, that Nordic sound. But then they listen to actual traditional Nordic folk and it's in major and people are dancing and it sounds happy. And so people are like, oh, that's not real Nordic, right? At least how people want the Nordics to be. So anyway, this is just supposed to really start the conversation on how you guys think Scandinavia is represented or misrepresented on the internet, especially through music, because that is one of the big, mission statements here on the Nordic Sound channel. So anyway, let's get back to the show. I just wanted to make sure that I put at the top of the video one of the very important reasons that I will be talking about traditional folk music here on the channel. So even though it would appear, judging just from this channel, that I am more of a Norwegian music guy, my first Nordic music love was actually Swedish folk music and the nyckelharpa. The nyckelharpa is the traditional Probably the most charismatic traditional instrument of Sweden. This instrument has gotten pretty popular lately, especially in soundtracks. I know I first heard it from a soundtrack, the Grizzly Hills soundtrack in World of Warcraft's Wrath of the Lich King. I was playing the video game, and as a kid, I just froze listening to this instrument, and this started my journey as an ethnomusicologist. As a little teenager, I immediately started trying to figure out what that friggin' instrument was, and I was hooked from then on. So, Swedish traditional music was my very first love in terms of Nordic traditional music. And of course, that leads me to the legendary Väsen, which is probably the most prominent Swedish folk music group, a trio for most of their time, but they are now a duo. On nyckelharpa is Olaf Johansson, on the viola violin is Mikael Maren, and on the guitar was Roger Tauroth. And this trio together has made some pretty crazy music over the years. They have not put out an album that I don't love. Their music was even featured at my wedding with Alyssa. She walked down the aisle to one of their wedding marches. So this band has a very special place in both my heart and Alyssa's heart. And I would have to recommend this band if you were looking to get into Swedish music. Even though they are not staunchly traditional, they do quite a bit of like experimental and fun stuff with the traditional formula. They still have very much the traditional Swedish music style at the core of their sound and the music that they make. So I would have to recommend their very first album, Väsen, to explore Swedish folk music. Maybe sort of go through the tracks, see what you like, see what you don't like. And this is pretty much a great introduction for, especially since most of my audience is American, this is a great introductory album for Americans looking to sort of get into Swedish folk music. Now, from experience, one of the most intimidating parts as a foreigner getting into the traditional Scandinavian folk scene is navigating the very intimidating naming convention for the tunes, right? So when you're going through the tracks on this album, for instance, you're going to see a lot of long, intimidating looking words, especially if you don't understand Swedish. But I promise there is both a convention and a formula to it. So the most common word you will see is going to be either the genre or the dance form. This is going to be anything like most commonly a polska or a march, anything like that, just the Swedish words for them. So look out for things like polska efter Gustav Struts. What that means is it's a polska, which is a dance form. It's like a reel in 3-time, to put it very simply. Efter means that it was either named after or it was sort of learned from Gustav Struts. Right, so that is an intimidating 4-word tune name, now has a logic to it. You also get sort of conjunct words, like in the very first track, Hälsingemarschen. This really just means that it's a march from Hälsingland, which is a region in Sweden. So the names look intimidating, but really what they're telling you is what kind of dance it is, who they learned it from, or what region it comes from. You will occasionally, especially as you get deeper into like more progressive folk or more contemporary folk, you will have people actually just like giving their tunes like what you would just call song names. But in the traditional side of things, that is the naming convention you can expect. So pay attention to the dance forms, maybe the regions, or if they're recurring people where you look at the song title and you're like, oh, I love this one. And then you look at it, it tends to be from the same person. Maybe look that person up. This is meant as a gateway into introducing you guys to traditional Nordic folk. And so for the Swedish side of things, I would highly recommend any of Väsen's albums, but the easiest starting point is just their very first album, Väsen, that you can then use and go chronologically through their discography and sort of like see how things evolve over time. For a band that's been around for, I'm pretty sure, 30 plus years, it's pretty interesting to go through their stylistic change over time. So, next up, let's get into Norway and Norwegian traditional music. And I should say here, I actually probably should have put this at the top. This list is not meant to be a comprehensive guide to Nordic traditional music at all, okay? No one album will ever give you a comprehensive understanding of a whole country's or a whole culture's traditional music scene. Okay, just a moment. The purpose of this video is not to teach you all about all Nordic folk musics in one video. I'm just trying to give you guys a sort of entry point into Nordic folk. And I would say, in terms of like listening and the actual sound of the music, I would say that Norway's traditional music, especially the Hardanger fiddle, tends to be the most intimidating to listen to or get into, just because of how different it can sound from the music that your average listener is more accustomed to listening to. Norwegian music tends to be very modal. Just to put it simply, it uses pitch collections that you probably aren't used to hearing. In particularly what we would call roughly Lydian, has two notes in it that when you put them together, it can sound a little weird to us. But these are just normal scales used in Norwegian traditional folk on the Hardanger fiddle. At the same time, the Hardanger fiddle itself, even though it's beautiful to look at and it is beautiful to listen to, it's very different from how people usually listen to what they would call a fiddle. It's a little bit higher pitched, it's got those sympathetic strings, and when you actually play that instrument's timbre in the unusual modes, it can sound very strikingly different to just your average listener. So Norway's folk music is a little harder to get into, in my experience, when you were trying to like get into Nordic folk music, but the perfect entry point actually came out this year. It is an album called, bear with me here, long name, Slåtter fra Kvam Ulvik Eidfjord og Ulinsvang. This is a compilation album of some of the most prominent Hardanger fiddlers, Knut Hamre and Benedicte Maurseth, who are two of my favorite. I have talked about them on the channel before. But then we also have Anlag Borsheim and Leila Renate Burestoli. So these four Hardanger fiddlers are, top of their class, all right? And they come together for this compilation album to explore the various Hardanger fiddle traditions around Norway. So naming conventions are pretty much the same that you can expect from Sweden, just because it's a different language, different names, different regions, and also different dances are the most important one. And while some of the dance forms you might recognize in Sweden, coming from just that general European dance culture, like waltzes, polkas, marches, that sort of thing, Norway sort of has its own little dance culture, and they have dances such as Hallings, Springars, Spring Lakes, and everything in between, and all these offshoots of all of these dances. So you don't have those familiar dances to latch onto, but that's actually kind of the fun, is because these rhythms are not what you expect. They're very irregular rhythms, and that's another part that kind of makes it hard to get into as just like your average listener. So this album is probably the best recommendation I could give anyone who's looking to get into trying to listen to Hardanger fiddling, because this is just a compilation from multiple different Hardanger fiddlers from different regions. They sort of explore a wider range than you would usually expect in an album of Hardanger fiddling. So this is my recommendation for those of you looking to get into Norwegian fiddling. Next up, we've got Finland. Finland is a bit of a wild card, as we have learned here on this channel, but also just looking at the history of Finland in juxtaposition to all of the Scandinavian countries. Come from a different language tree, but are definitely intertwined with Scandinavian culture. And this comes through in the music, because you can either get Finnish folk music that comes from primarily from the regions that are very Swedish influenced. This is like Österbotten and Nyland. These are regions that actually have more Swedish than Finnish names and speak both Finnish and Swedish. And so music from this region is going to sound pretty Swedish, just with like a little bit of like a Finnish flavoring to it. But all of the traditional Finnish music not from these regions are actually, strangely enough, going to sound more what you would expect Slavic folk music to sound like. But this is not the video to cover the geopolitical or the sociocultural history of Finland. Instead, I'm just using this to sort of explain that it's difficult to give one album that introduces you to just general Finnish folk music, right? So with all that said, though, if you do want at least some entry point into Finnish traditional music, I could not more highly recommend 5 out of 5's album, 5 out of 5. I recently discovered these guys actually this year, and they have been on the regular rotation for me whenever I get that itch to listen to traditional music. So these guys definitely have like that more Swedish Finnish influence in them, but they have two things that I've found that characterize Finnish folk music more than the other Nordics, and this is more accordion. There's definitely accordion in Swedish and Norwegian history. The accordion has a little bit of a dramatic position, but in Finnish music, there's just way more accordion. And I would also just say, like, more energy. I don't know how else to describe it, but whenever I'm listening to a Finnish album, especially this one, I can tell it's Finnish just because it's just, like, a lot of fun, right? If you think of how Korpiklauni approached folk metal in their early albums, right, a lot of what people loved about them is their high energy, a lot of fun. That translates right over from Finnish folk music. But since Finnish folk music is not directly from the same traditions that Swedish or Norwegian are from, it doesn't really have the same naming convention, and it seems like a lot of these Finnish bands do prefer to just like give them unique names. So it's a little bit more approachable in that sense. So if you're looking to get into Finnish traditional music, 5 out of 5's album 5 out of 5 is a great entry point, and then also explore the band Frigg, which I have talked about very highly on this channel before. And will definitely appear on my top albums of 2023. But let's save that for later. So of all of the like core homeland Nordic countries, I know I'm leaving out the Faroes, I know I'm leaving out Iceland, Svalbard, etc., but of like the core countries as an introduction to traditional Nordic music, I got one left here, and Finland was a wild card. Denmark is a sleeping card. That's probably the most convoluted way for me to just say that Denmark's traditional folk scene has been pretty sleepy. All right, it's been slow to like latch on to the traditional folk music scene. It just historically has not had much interest in traditional folk music. And this is not just some American just like speaking from nowhere. I have heard this from many musicians from Denmark, from Sweden, and who are in that music scene shared by southern Sweden and Denmark, right? So I'm not just talking out my ass here. Especially if you go looking for traditional Danish music, it's very difficult to find anything, right? And so this is why my traditional folk music introduction from Denmark here is actually going to be from the Danish String Quartet. They're a classical music quartet, but they have this lovely album. This is the album that I discovered them through. They have this lovely album called Woodworks. And the Danish String Quartet is led by Rune Tonsgaard Sørensen, and he has been a major advocate in traditional Danish music. And he is the first chair violinist for the Danish String Quartet. If I remember correctly, he's also just like the director. And then he's also in Dreamer's Circus, that progressive folk band that has both Swedish and Danish members. So he's been a huge part of getting that traditional music scene up and running with Denmark. And this album is sort of a love letter to that, just in a string quartet format. So it is a little weird me saying like traditional folk music, but then giving you a string quartet, but this is the best that I have. If anyone has any better suggestions, please send them my way. But at the same time, this is not a horrible introduction at all, because I have this on CD. I love this album. This album, like thematically, bear with me here, this album thematically explores wood, okay? The wood of old barns, the wood that makes fiddles, and the traditional life around woodworking. Is there anything more traditional than working with wood? And that's sort of like the theme of this album. And so through looking at the culture of woodworking, making things with wood, that old traditional culture, this album was the way that the Danish String Quartet would take a lot of Danish folk tunes, arrange them for a string quartet, but play them. There is definitely some of the classical aesthetics with it, but mostly this album just treats it like folk music. And in that way, it's kind of an interesting introduction to Danish folk music, but this was mine, and now it's yours if you take my word for it. So especially the Sonderho Bridal Trilogy that is sort of woven throughout this album. Those are probably my favorite tunes, but there are also a lot of others as well. With any of these albums, just go through the whole thing if you want an introduction. No one track is going to give you just like a decent enough taster to know if you are into this region's traditional folk music or not. But then also, with all that said, you know, if you do want something that is on the more traditional side, of course, if you remember from last year, Emilie Lorentzen put out Modersmål, which was her love letter to Bornholmian folk music. Now, Bornholm is in an interesting position because it's actually way closer to Sweden than it is to Denmark, and they have a very interesting cultural history there. But it is technically Denmark, so what I would say is also if you want something on the more traditional side of things, maybe you can't, for some reason, you can't stand the sound of a string quartet, and you want something on the more traditional side of things, Emilie Lorentzen's Modersmål is an incredible EP of Danish or Bornholmian traditional music. And she's an incredible singer, and there's just so much to love about this EP. But I fawned over that EP enough last year. I'm merely giving it to you now as yet another option if you want to be introduced into Nordic traditional folk, Danish in particular.
Andra mængde skulle gæste fara, og min mæng riger etter, og andre mæng.
So, these are my 5 albums I have for you guys looking to get into traditional folk music. So next time I find myself swinging back around to folk music, I will be doing a video covering the prog folk scene in Scandinavia. You know, prog folk is, think of what prog rock is to rock. You're taking all these different elements from other genres and just mixing it up with a folk music base. The prog folk scene in Scandinavia is crazy, but it's also incredible, and so I sort of want to give you guys a way to get into the progressive side of the Scandinavian folk scene, because particularly out of Sweden, the prog folk scene is just a gift. It's a delight. And so next time I swing back around, I'm definitely going to be giving you guys a little introduction to that side of the folk music scene as well. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed maybe getting a little bit of an introduction to the traditional folk music scene of Scandinavia. I've told you guys this is very near and dear to my heart. This is perhaps my favorite kind of music of all of the music that I talk about and listen to. It's what I play the most. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys find something of use and something beautiful that you can enjoy for the rest of your lives in these albums. And I will see you later.